Well, good evening. This is Janice Courtcamp and doing Syria Face-to-Face, episode 16, a live Facebook video discussion on Syria, of course. And tonight I'm going to ramble as I usually do for a bit as people come online. And it is, I guess it's June 2nd today. We had a wonderful summer day today. Very relaxing. And welcome those of you who have joined. I have a confession to make. I am not prepared for tonight, and it's not because I didn't try. I sat down many times over the course of the week to try to lay out this talk, and to be honest with you, each and every time, my thoughts and my talk, because I often talk to myself, as I've said before, would spiral off in every possible direction. And I realized it's because this is a very emotional topic for me. And I would get angry and frustrated and bitter and sad and impassioned and wanting to kind of say everything and not knowing how to possibly describe this to Western audiences, particularly in America. So I'm going to try as much as I can to watch your comments to see you all bringing things up. Those of you who are my friends, I'm so thankful to see you all joining in. People who haven't joined in, you're most welcome here. And feel free to add comments, and I'll try to get to them if I possibly can. There's always a delay, so it's a little awkward as I'm talking about one topic. You'll be asking questions or making comments about that, but I don't see it, for a minute or two afterwards. And so it's hard to kind of go back and address those things, but I'll do my best. All that being said, this is episode 16, and what we're going to be talking about tonight is the story of what happened in Aleppo. And as I go through some of this story, I'm going to try to bring that into perspective of what is happening in Idlib, Syria right now, and what is the reality of what is going on versus what you're seeing in mainstream media and hearing from Western governments. So here we go into the story of Aleppo. Hello, everyone. Welcome. I'll start tonight with the story of Mr. A. He's a friend of mine in Aleppo, and I want to tell you a little bit about this man. Mr. A is truly, I guess what we would call in the West, a Renaissance man. It's very easy to spend hours and hours listening to Mr. A's story. He's a world traveler. He has lived in Europe for a long time. He is a man of Aleppo. He was born and raised there. He was a tour guide leader before the war. He owned boutique hotels. I mean, he is a walking encyclopedia of Syrian history and politics and culture. He is just an extraordinary fellow, and one of the best hosts you could possibly ever hope for. And I had a small group with me at the time, and we were staying in, for this trip I was alone, but with some friends, and we stayed in Mr. A's hotel. It's a boutique hotel in the very heart of ancient old Aleppo. And, we're talking tiny little alleyways. Many of the streets are cobblestone. This area of Aleppo goes back to the dawn of civilization itself. Aleppo is the oldest continuously inhabited city in the world. Damascus is the second. It's the oldest continuously inhabited capital city of the world. So we're talking these, Aleppo is a grand dame. Aleppo is one of the world's great cities. And and its oldest continuously inhabited city. So when you're talking about the old part of Aleppo, you're talking as old as it gets anywhere you can find in the world. And Mr. A had just reopened, was just in the process of reopening his boutique hotel in the old city of Aleppo. Years before, it had been taken over by some of the terrorists that had taken that part of the city. And, you know, of course, being terrorists, they had ransacked the place, had desecrated it, had you know, looted everything they could possibly get. And I'm not talking just about things, I'm talking about, you know, fixtures and copper, anything that they could steal from it, they stole it, and they did considerable damage. You know, and it's the kind of damage really that only humans do to one another. It's not the kind of damage that you get from an earthquake, let's say, which Aleppo has suffered in its history as well. But it's that vengeful, violent, vindictive kind of attack, if you will, that barbarian hordes are famous for. So these terrorists had taken over Mr. A's hotel, just a beautiful little building in the heart of the old city of Aleppo, and had held on to it for several years until it was liberated along with the rest of the city of Aleppo in December of 2016. And on this trip, this was in November of 2018, they were just about ready for the grand reopening of the hotel. And, you know, it was still rather, let's see, rustic. It was beautifully redone. I mean, you turn every corner and there's some kind of fascinating piece of artwork to look for, or craftsmanship in the stone masonry or the woodwork or the textiles that were used in the curtains and the bedding and that sort of thing. So there was limited power. There were some generators that had been set up in the old city to provide power for people rebuilding, and you know, and that was on for just a few certain hours in the day. They had just gotten hot water running again in the showers, and they were very proud of that. And so my friend and I were there, and we spent the night. And, you know, in the evening, it was candlelight and flashlights, and we were sitting around. I was drinking arak, which is the national liquor of Syria. It's a lot like ouzo in Greece. And we were having tea and sweets and that sort of thing. And Mr. A pulled out a little bit of incense. It was the one thing that had been left behind by the terrorists that had taken over his hotel and done so much damage. And he was pretty tickled. He thought that was kind of ironic that, you know, of all things, they left some incense. And so we were burning the incense as he was telling some stories. The next day, he took me on a walking tour of the old part of the city, and, you know, going back to ancient history as well as the modern history of the conflict. And at one point, I asked him, what was the, what really awakened you to the idea, to the fact that this so-called civil war, this violence that had started in your city, was not some kind of organic revolution, that it was not about a popular uprising against the leader of Syria, President Assad. And he said, you know, actually it was very easy, and I knew right away. And I asked him why, and he said, because the people that were here doing the protests, now, I really want to try to make this clear. There were demonstrations calling for reforms in the Syrian government. As I've said many times, everybody wants reforms in the government. You know, this is similar to how if you have the Tea Party people in DC, or the Occupy Wall Street movement, or any number of demonstrations that we have to express discontent with the government overall or certain policy. Okay, so everybody wants reforms in the government, but those demonstrations were not calling for a dissolution of the government. They weren't calling for the government for the leader to step down. And it would be it would be similar to if the Tea Party or the Occupy Wall Street movement, some people from those demonstrations, knocked on the door of the White House and said, we want the keys to Washington. We're going to take over the White House. We're going to take over the government. What would the answer be to them? So, of course, a government, the legitimate government of the sovereign nation state of Syria, is not just going to hand over the keys to the government and step down because there are some demonstrators that want reforms, So there were the demonstrations that wanted reforms, and there were protests, and many of these protests were called Days of Rage. Oh, we're going to have a Day of Rage protest at such and such street corner. And those protests that were calling for President Assad to step down, that were calling for revolution, that were calling for the overthrow of the government, were anything but peaceful. Oftentimes, actually, they didn't exist at all. There were just a couple of guys on the street corner, and they had their video camera, and they'd shake their video camera and say, there's a whole bunch of us, and we want, President Assad to step down. In any event, what Mr. A was saying was those people that were protesting and wanting President Assad to step down were not from the city of Aleppo. That they were speaking in different accents. In other words, they were coming from villages outside of the city of Aleppo, as well as other countries. And they were the ones calling for President Assad to step down. And they were the ones that, for example, would go to the local police stations and kill everyone in the police station. This is an example of what the U.S. government and Western governments and media were calling, the peaceful protesters. So Mr. A realized very early on that this was a sponsored, manufactured regime change attempt war. And if those of us who know this story, that this is the reality, that this was a manufactured, created war against the sovereignty of Syria, if that's the one message that we can put forth to people to get them to understand what is really going on there, that is a key message. Someone just signed in from Boston, and actually that's an illustration that I wanted to make. For Americans, let's say you're in Boston, one of the great cities of America. This has been here as long as America's been a country, for example. And all of a sudden you're seeing these protests, and they're calling for the overthrow of the government. Now, people in Boston, as my friend will say, have a distinctive accent. It's a very strong accent. And let's just say the protesters that are there calling for the overthrow of the government are all speaking with a Mississippi accent. That would actually create a lot of questioning in your mind as to who are these people, what are they doing in Boston, and why are they protesting here, pretending to be Bostonians. This is a similar thing. I wanted to share a little bit about Syria in general, because I find this fascinating. Is the people in Syria have what I would call very good ears. They're very tuned into music, and this idea of the accent. So if you're in Aleppo, you have a certain accent, of course, in Homs, in Damascus, Latakia, Deir ez-Zor, but it can even get to such a fine point that you could have two villages 20 or 30 kilometers apart from each other, and the claim is that they could tell from the accent that somebody is from one of those villages and not the other. And so when you hear somebody say, oh, they didn't speak like a person from the city of Aleppo, that is something that they can discern very easily. Louis, you asked if Shaah can watch this. Shaah can watch this, and I wanted to talk about my friend Shaah. Shaah is a brilliant Armenian electrical engineer, and he's wild and he's crazy, and he's my bro up in Aleppo. And I met Shaah online years ago in the middle of the worst part of things, and he and I actually remember the story slightly differently, but it's close enough that it's worth retelling. So I had seen him on a friend's page, and he was talking about mortars were hitting all around, and he was very worried, but he wanted to leave his apartment because a food shipment had actually finally arrived. They had gone for so long. Aleppo, the city of Aleppo, half of it was in control of terrorist gangs, and the surrounding countryside, for the most part, had completely surrounded the city with terrorist groups. So we're talking ISIS, Al-Qaeda, and half a dozen major terrorist armies had surrounded the city of Aleppo and the countryside. And so getting food in was very difficult, but they had finally gotten a supply of food in, and he was going to risk going to where the food was coming, even though a mortar attack by the terrorist rebels was going on. And so he had gone to where the food had come into, and he had taken a picture of the floor of the building where the food was being stored and distributed, and it was a red, pulpy mess. And when I first saw the video, I was horrified. I thought it was blood and guts, of people that had been killed in the attack, because there had been a mortar that hit right near the food distribution place. And he said, no, that was the tomatoes, and he was almost as heartbroken about those tomatoes getting destroyed than he would have, I'm exaggerating there, but they were just had their hearts set on some fresh vegetables. And, it's kind of representative of his particular kind of humor. And so we actually started becoming friends there. And at that time, and over the years, I've actually met him many times and his family in Syria, in Aleppo, and in Damascus. And, it just always does my heart good. One time I went to Aleppo, and Shaah was meeting me, and he had written on his T-shirt, welcome to Aleppo Janus Court Camp, Mr. Sid, you're a lucky man. And, and a big black Sharpie on this T-shirt, and he went with us. I was with a group at the time to go watch a football or soccer match at a local arena. So that's my buddy Shaah in Aleppo. So the story of Aleppo is this. As these, the people from the countryside, certain villages that were aligned with Turkey, had come into the city, had created all this chaos and mess, that were backed and supported by the US, UK, Israel, Saudi Arabia, Qatar, and Turkey. They had formed into various militias, armed groups. Some of them were full-out armies. The primary army at the time, and I'm talking in 2012 now, was what has been called the Free Syrian Army. And this is the US-backed FSA, the Free Syrian Army. And it was also backed by, and it is continuing to be backed by, Turkey. The Free Syrian Army consisted primarily of members of the Muslim Brotherhood Mafia. The Muslim Brotherhood is an outlawed organization in Syria, like I said before, and should be outlawed around the world. And so these militias formed, and they all shared the same basic common objective. The objective was, you have Syria, which is led by President Assad, who is from an Alawite family that is considered an offshoot of Shia Islam. And although he's married to a lady from a Sunni family, my great hero, the First Lady, Asma Assad. Keep in mind that most of the people, the army is made up of Sunnis and Alawites and traditional Shiites and Christians and Druze, and there are Kurds and there are Ismailis, and all these various people of Syria make up the Syrian army. The Syrian government is the same way. The Muslim Brotherhood, however, is a Sunni organization. I call it a mafia. And their objective, along with Saudi Arabia and Qatar, with Turkey, was to turn Syria from being a secular nation state to being an Islamist state. So let me dive into that a little bit, because this is very important. And I'm trying to think of how to do that in the best possible way. In Syria, the government respects and protects all religious groups. Okay, so for example, if you have a family who is Sunni who wants to practice a fundamentalist form of Sunni Islam, they are free to do that. Their women can wear full burqas, they can have, 4 wives, they can live at the mosque, they have that freedom to worship in the way that they choose. You can also be a Christian who goes to church and to a bar. You can wear shorts and tank tops, like I've said before. You could be an Alawite. You could, visit, there are many shrines related to Shia Islam, for example. You could be a traditional Shiite. You can be what you choose to be. And this is something that's very powerful and important to the great majority of Syrian people. The thing is that you're not allowed to require your neighbor to worship and have the same faith and be under the same traditions and laws or rules of yours. Okay? So this is what we call secularism. This is what secularism is in Syria. And the reason I have to describe that is because if you walk down the street and polled 100 different Americans and you said, what does it mean for a country to be secular? I would suspect that maybe 1 out of 100 would have any clue what that means. Okay, so we have to describe these things. And welcome again, everyone. I see a lot of people joining. And if you're Syrian and I say anything that you disagree with or feel I'm misrepresenting, please comment and add that to the comments. So not only is Syria secular in the sense of the government does not force any religion on anyone. Many Syrians, in fact, are total atheists. Many are deists where they believe in God, but they don't believe in organized religion in any way. And that's a quite a number of people there. But it was live and let live. You have your religion, I have mine. Let's be friends. Let's, have a meal together. Let's have a cup of tea together. Okay, this is the secularism of Syria. So these groups that were coming in and doing these days of rage and these protests and demanding that President Assad step down, they all shared the same basic ideology of Syria not being a secular country anymore, but to be controlled by, be a Sunni-based state, okay, controlled by, members of the Muslim Brotherhood, people that were paid by Saudi Arabia and Qatar, for example. I have to explain what I mean when I say Sharia, because again, Sid and I talk to so many people and they have no clue whatsoever. Most people have never heard that term and they have no idea what it is. And then you have another group of people that just believe all Sharia law looks like Saudi Arabia, and it's kind of like the devil's. In reality, Sharia law is just a version of running a society based on principles of Islam, and that can be it can be anything. But these guys, their intentions were to persecute religious minorities, to drive out religious minorities, to, in some cases, outright kill or attempt genocide against religious minorities, for example, the Alawites in particular, and to enforce their interpretation of Sharia law over the country. Okay, and I hope that this is making sense to people. So the groups that were called rebels in Syria shared the Islamist ideology. And the groups that, the people, which are the great majority of the Syrian people, which oppose this, are the people that you never, ever hear about in Western mainstream media, that have never, no Western government has ever expressed sympathy for the great majority of people who have stood against these so-called rebels and what they wanted to do in Syria. Going back to the story of Aleppo. So these Islamist groups had taken over half the city, and as I said, they had surrounded much of the city. And this was the situation for a number of years. So you had half the city under the control of the terrorist groups, which then I'm just going to refer to them as that from now on, because all of those groups had officially put themselves under submission to Al-Qaeda. Then you had the rest of the city, which was over 1.5 million people. Before the war, Aleppo was 4 million people. You had these people in Western Aleppo that was under the control of the Syrian government and the Syrian army that you never ever heard from. As the battles began to take back control of the part of Aleppo that was under control of these terrorist groups, all of the, in mainstream media from the West, from the Western governments, all you heard all day long was Aleppo is burning. That there's this human catastrophe occurring in eastern Aleppo. This is the area under control of these so-called rebel, the terrorist groups. And if the world didn't step in, and you saw reports from Israel, of course, and Turkey, and Saudi Arabia, and Qatar, but also France, Britain, Canada, Australia, Norway, Sweden, Denmark, and of course the US. All of these countries were saying this battle for Aleppo was going to be a huge humanitarian catastrophe and disaster. The reality was, you were hearing these reports that the Syrian forces and their allies of Iran and Hezbollah and Russia, of course, were targeting one hospital after another. They were destroying, they were just bombing at will. They were, making life a living hell in eastern Aleppo, and the poor civilians that were trapped there were, if the Syrians and the Russians were able to come in and take over terrorist-controlled eastern Aleppo, that they were going to mass murder all of these civilians. The soldiers were going to rape all of the women, just like I said, the world had to step in and save Aleppo. This is when the white helmets really came to the forefront of Western attention. So this is the group that was created by a British mercenary. They get funded to the tune of over $100 million from the UK and US and other countries. And their job is to create propaganda to make it look like these so-called rebel terrorists are these great freedom fighters, etc. And the white helmets were coming out with all kinds of stuff. They were saving one baby after another. They were just, the heroes of humanity. There was a documentary film made about them. Now get this, the producers of the film never stepped foot in Syria. The producers of the film were in Turkey. And so they took all this white helmets footage that was very carefully staged and edited and cut, and they created this very slick documentary that got a lot of people there, just their hearts were racing for concern for, eastern Aleppo. And that film was called The Last Men in Aleppo, and it won an Oscar, and, these were the heroes. The reality was much different, of course. What happened was a combination of, first and foremost, I want to talk about the Syrian Army for a minute, because in Western media, from Western governments, what you'll hear the Syrian armed forces being called are Assad's forces. Okay, so let's just come up with an alternative, illustrative story. Let's just say America, has been invaded by, let's see, the equivalent number, we're like 3.3 million, 330 million people. So the equivalent number, let's say over 3 million jihadists from over 60 other documented countries had come in across the border from Canada and from Mexico and had invaded, were literally attacking all of our towns and cities, and they were being helped by a certain percentage of people here. And we have our Army, our Navy, our Marines, our Coast Guard, whatever, and calling our armed forces Trump's forces. That's a similar thing. The Syrian Arab Army is the army of the sovereign, independent nation state of Syria. It is made up of only Syrians. Their task is to defend Syria from enemies, foreign and domestic, and that is what they do. They are the Syrian Armed forces. They are assisted in their efforts to defend their country from these terrorist groups that have come in from so many other countries, and domestic terrorists as well that joined this fight. And, so those are the players that we have. So the Syrian Army, the legitimate defenders of the nation state of Syria and its allies of Iran, Hezbollah, and Russia, that were invited in to help by the legitimate government of the sovereign nation of Syria. They went in and they took over eastern Aleppo from these terrorist groups that had been holding it. And here's how they did it. First, they made it very clear that the attacks were going to start. In other words, they pre-announced that the main battle was coming. They encouraged civilians to leave the area of eastern Aleppo, on a temporary basis until after the battles would be finished. So they pre-announced their intentions. They created what were called humanitarian corridors. So they guarded the protection, they guarded and protected any civilians that were left eastern Aleppo to avoid the big battles, and they were free to go to other parts of Syria while the battle was going on, okay? In addition to that, they were negotiating with various armed groups there to lay down their arms so you could surrender. And if you didn't want to surrender, you could actually get on these green buses and relocate to Idlib province. Okay, that's very important for people to understand. So there were negotiations going on to avoid a massive loss of life and infrastructure. There were precision bombings going on. Let's talk about how the Syrian army and the allies were constantly, wow, this time went really fast, were constantly being accused of attacking hospitals. Hi, Sid. So, for example, we were constantly told in Western mainstream media that this was happening, that the Syrian Arab Army and allies were targeting hospitals. Now, this was one after another. So literally, at the end of this time, you would have thought that there were 20,000 hospitals in eastern Aleppo. Okay, they would call, if it was a weapon, an arsenal, they would call that a hospital. If it was a headquarters for terrorist groups, they would could just call it a hospital. Okay. When I was in eastern Aleppo and have been there several times now, one of the places that I went to was something that before the war was an eye and ear hospital in eastern Aleppo. But while the terrorist groups were in charge of the area, it was not used as a hospital. It had been taken over and it was used as a Sharia court and jail. So you had one building in the hospital that was the woman's jail. You had the main building of the hospital that was the courthouse and the main jail for the men. So this is what, if that, when that was attacked, it was called an attack on a hospital. Other hospitals, that were supposedly set up, but these are field hospitals, they're unmarked. Oftentimes they don't even exist, or they're very kind of haphazard, like I said, unmarked little field hospitals that may have provided some medical care for the fighters and their families. So this is what I'm trying to say to you, is that when the Syrian army and the allies took over eastern Aleppo, they did it in the way that would result in the least amount of loss of human life, loss of infrastructure. They did everything they could to get civilians out and safe. And by the way, as many of the civilians were trying to escape eastern Aleppo before the fighting, the so-called rebels that the U.S. and all of its allies support, they would kill the people trying to leave. They had grossly overestimated the number of civilians living in eastern Aleppo. They had said at one point it was like 1.5 million people. It turned out to be about 10 or 20% of that. And this is the reason they do this, is because if they say, oh, we have 1.5 million people and we're under siege by the Syrian army and its allies, they're going to get more food, more aid, more support from the U.S. and its allies. So let's just go back. Sid is here. The main thing that I want to tell you is that all of that happened in eastern Aleppo is happening right now in Idlib. And so we're already getting the reports as the Syrian army and its allies are trying to liberate Idlib, that is controlled by Al-Qaeda. The people that live in Idlib are under the tyranny of terrorist groups. Their children don't go to school. They go to, jihadi schools and religious instruction and that sort of thing. The people that are in Idlib now, many of them are not from Idlib. They came in from other areas of Syria and other countries. They actually dislocated the actual residents of Idlib to take it over. They have committed terrible atrocities against civilians. They've driven out and killed religious minorities. They have imposed a harsh, punitive, strict interpretation of Sharia law over the area. So the women, of Syria that used to be able to wear shorts and tank tops and go to university and become physicists if they want to, in areas under government control, in Idlib, of course, they're required to be fully covered, and they are often, sold as wives to these foreign fighters and that sort of thing. There was just a mass execution of civilians in Idlib that were, accused of supporting the Syrian government. So this is what what I'm saying is you're going to get all kinds of crazy reports. Or, you're going to get a report one after another of the Syrians hitting one hospital after another, for example, of, going to create this terrible human catastrophe. Please understand, we've seen it before. I've been to Aleppo 4 times since it was liberated from those terrorist groups. When I first saw it, the people were walking dead. Their eyes were sunk. There was no joy in the people. They had lived through hell. The last time I was there was light returning to their eyes. So much rebuilding has occurred that it's staggering. And, many hundreds of thousands of people have returned to live in their city. Things are still hard there. Life is still very difficult. But it's a lot better than what it was when terrorists held half the city. I hope for all that disorganization and lack of planning that I was able to make some points here tonight. And here is my husband, Sid, to join us. And what did you want to talk about, honey?
Move over a little bit.
I will be happy to.
Hello, good evening. First off, last week when I did the roll call, I left out Jimmy Dore's name.
Yeah.
And I remember when I first heard Jimmy Dore, it just out of the blue came up, and I'm going, whoa. What has taken me a long time to learn and understand and put the pieces together was flowing off of his lips just like a waterfall.
Yeah, he's amazing.
He's amazing. So Jan's been talking for 45 minutes, and kind of we've gone through a real learning curve over the last 5 years.
6.5.
6.5 years. Time flies when you're having war. And I remember somebody sharing how the old Soviet news, everybody, all the Russians knew they were listening to propaganda, and they learned to listen through what was being said. Where the majority of our nation still, they just want either their conservative or their liberal take on what's going on. Same dragon, two different hats, but haven't learned to listen through. Now we have some two different, very dear friends we know personally, who, like in Aleppo, lived in Aleppo. Terrorists come in. They handed their house keys to the terrorists. Much better deal than dying. And basically the deal is, you keep paying the electric bill and we won't blow your house up. So here we are. I'm listening to the news. The Syrian Arab Army is pressing in, and our news says, oh, the Syrian Arab Army has just driven the occupants out of such and such a village.
Yeah, Assad's forces have driven.
Assad's forces have driven the. How can you drive the? You nasty dude! You've driven the occupants, meaning the human beings or animals or whatever that are occupying the house, not the owners of the house, because the owners have fled. The occupants. And so as I'm really learning to listen to the news, and I have heard reporters use the word we and us when referring to Al-Qaeda. That is that slow, hey, let's get a vaccine, let's get inoculated, let me make you numb. Okay, we, who's we now? We, the moderate rebels and we are the same thing. Well, most of you don't know Tano and the Lone Ranger. But Tano was an Indian, and he'd always look at the Lone Ranger and say, what you mean we, white man? And that ain't no we when it comes to me. So
yeah, can I interject something there?
Why? Go ahead.
Well, you know, we had Clarissa Ward of CNN going to Eastern Aleppo at one point, just like we had a reporter from Sky News going recently to Idlib, another female reporter. And there's Clarissa Ward. I've talked about this a couple times. She's dressed head to foot in black. She's not allowed to wear makeup. She looks like, you know, she just is about ready to go into her grave. And she's there talking about the wonderful freedom in Eastern Aleppo. And there I am at the same time in Syria, in Damascus and Latakia and Homs. You know, I can go out and have
drinking in a bar, worshiping in the churches, smoking the hookah, yep, riding in cars with men that if
wearing whatever I wanted to.
That if danger came towards her, they would put their life between her and the danger. See, the difference, if you kill for what you believe, you are a murderer. If you die for what you believe, you are a martyr. You cannot defend your country 7,000 miles away. And this was the big lie that we have been handed. We are defending America by toppling Libya. We are defending America by northern Sudan. We're defending America for bombing Kosovo for 74 days straight, right through Easter. We are defending America by invading Iraq. You know, I've got good friends that work in neat jobs and they're neat people. And this one guy, he does water. He does. I mean, he just loves the woods and this and that. And we were talking. He goes, "Yeah, I knew where every water supply was in Iraq, and all we had to do is go in and shut down somebody's water, and they just come on out." And I'm going, "Wait a second, dude. Are you proud about going 7,000 miles away and shutting down somebody's water so that big oil can get in there?" My wife was talking about the white helmets and how I love this series of pictures of the white helmets rescuing this kid. And then in another town, they are rescuing this kid. And in another town, they're rescuing this kid. And it's the same damn kid. Now, if that kid gets in that much trouble, he should be whooped by his parents. Like, boy, stay out of trouble. Now, home. Yeah, it is. And stay closer to home. The degree of the fabrication. Just yesterday in Dara. Dara is on the Jordan border-ish. The Syrian Army overran a terrorist stronghold. And one of the things that they got from there was 4 tons of American-made C4. Explosive, big boy explosives. 4 tons. That would be more than my pickup truck could haul if stacked straight up. 4 tons of C4 that just happened to be there. That's a controlled substance. And you'll never hear this on the news.
Yeah.
American-made C4 in the hands of Sunni radicalized jihadists. You were talking about East Aleppo, and didn't they have a 2,000-bed cancer hospital?
In the countryside outside of Aleppo, kind of in a suburb, I think it's more on the west side, was the Kindi Hospital. And that was the premier cancer treatment facility, really, of the region.
2,000 beds, and all service was free.
All service was free.
The United States of America has nothing to compare to that. We fall short. We've been weighed in the balance and found wanting.
Well, and the thing with the Kindi Hospital is that it was surrounded by these terrorist groups. A siege was put on it. You know, the civilians and the patients had been evacuated for the most part, but there was a group of Syrian soldiers holding the hospital,
defending it.
and the terrorists took a truck loaded with C4, as a matter of fact, I think it was, and blew up half the hospital, and not really a word in Western media about the U.S. sponsored, moderate rebels doing this kind of act. And so they don't care about hospitals in Syria. They only care about, things that so-called rebel terrorists call hospitals in order to get sympathy for the terrorists.
Now, Idlib is coming up. 6 months ago, we were so excited because we'd been waiting 2 years for the Battle of Idlib.
Yeah.
And 6 months ago, there was nothing that was going to stop it. It was time. Syrian Army, Russia, they're coming in. Some huge talks, threats, chess moves, political things went on. And basically Putin goes, we're going to hold off for a bit.
To negotiate with Turkey.
Yeah, a lot of stuff got rearranged because what you're dealing with is within Idlib at that time, conservative 50,000, high-end 100,000, trained, hardened, paid jihadists.
Mm-hmm.
That is a huge asset if you're trying to overthrow Sunni radicalized Islamists. They're fighters, they're dogs. So 6 months goes by, and you know Turkey borders Idlib, so they pulled out a lot, they put in a lot, shifted around, sent some to Canada, send the white helmets to Canada, because they're big-hearted people, they'll love them. And so the Battle of Idlib has started, and our news is going to absolutely stay on it, because see, basically, big picture, what do you have going on right now? What you hear on the news doesn't really matter. You have Syria, you have the Euphrates River. Everything to the north and east of the Euphrates is, I don't want to say rebel held, but it's rebel held because it's in rebellion to the country. That's where the oil is. Syria has gotten no oil revenue from that area for about 5 years. U.S. troops are up there. Kurds are up there. Free Syrian Army's up there. There's still pockets of ISIS, Al-Qaeda, all kinds of, as the U.S. worded it 2 years ago, well, we're redoing what we're doing in Syria, but we're going to develop an 18,000 person border defense group. Meaning we're going to train jihadists to defend the border so we can continue to steal the oil. 3 oil tankers got blown up in the last month trying to bring oil into Syria. How do you starve a nation? You starve them by stealing their freedom gas. That's what they call it now, isn't it? Freedom gas.
Freedom particle or something. Yeah.
Freedom gas. We're just borrowing their freedom gas. It's like, yeah, can I borrow that from you? You ain't gonna get it back.
That's an important point, and we're out of time actually. But finish what you want to say.
Well, so Idlib is coming up. The war hasn't ended. You got C4 on the southern border. You've got huge sanctions on the country. Longer we can drag it out, the longer we can suck their resources dry. Let's just keep cutting off the oil coming in. Israel is a huge, huge, deadly player, and they will not back down. They are in the wrong. They are the aggressors. If you kill for what you believe, you're a murderer. If you die defending your homeland from an invading force, you are a martyr. Big, big difference. Now, Janice Lee Courtcamp.
Yes, sir.
I want to congratulate you.
Thank you.
I want to congratulate you in advance.
Okay.
Because you have on your Facebook page, you've got this little thing that says followers.
Yeah.
And it's at 9,998.
No way, really?
So the next time we meet, she will have 10,000 followers.
Well, and that's a great point, because it's because of you all, watching and sharing and following and encouraging. And if it wasn't for the encouragement and support of this man and our family and you guys, I don't know what I would be doing right now. So thank you so much for that. I really appreciate it. Thank you, honey. I'm drinking tonight what is called Polo, which is lemonade with mint. If you go into a cafe in Syria and order Polo, you'll get a lovely, refreshing drink. And it's also the name of a certain kind of shisha with a lemon mint flavor that you can smoke in the hookah. So that might be a good thing to do tonight too.
Put that in your pipe and smoke it.
Well, have a good night, everyone. Again, thanks for watching. Leave your comments and questions, and I will answer each and every one of them.
And if you've never seen Jimmy Dore,
yeah, look him up.
That is your homework between now and next week. Jimmy Dore Show.
This is the end of the Jan and Sid Show.
Say good night, Jan.
Good night, Jan.